Hello, everybody.
Hey. Hi, y'all. I'm John Schieber. Just a show of hands, how many of y'all are entrepreneurs in the audience right now? Let me see if I can, let's get a number. Oh, a fair few of y'all. How many of y'all are investors? Cool. And how many of y'all just came out to see Steve because he's one of the architects of the modern internet and an incredible entrepreneur and human? All right, that's good.
They probably thought this was like the Preds and walked into the wrong building. By the way, I must say, things are on fire here in Nashville. Looking at all the cranes and the momentum, and last night we had dinner in the Gulch and seeing what's happened there. But it's also pretty remarkable this week. You got the Stanley Cup at CMAs, coming later in the week, Bonnaroo. And of course, 3686, which I think is the best of all.
Well, I mean,
celebrating
hands
startups
down.
and promoting innovation and creating jobs and
All of the things. All
in 1 week. So
well,
obviously, Nashville's rising. It's sort of on the move.
Yeah, a perfect example of the rise of the rest. Now, we have so much to talk about with The Third Wave, your book, which is, I think, enjoying its second or third week atop the New York Times business bestseller list. If y'all haven't picked up a copy, here it is. I'm not shilling at all. It's a fantastic book. And there's a lot to talk about with industrialization and politics and the role that all of this has to play in the rise of the rest and the third wave of innovation and where it's coming from. But I want to ask a really important, critical question first. Now, in your book, you mentioned that you used to hang out at CBGB, and I want to know, what was your favorite show that you saw at that club? We're in Music City right now, so let's bring it to music. What was your favorite concert?
I have to get the cobwebs out, because it was the mid-'70s when I was in New York at this club. For those familiar with, sort of the most known, respected, even though it was kind of a dive, kind of rock clubs in the New York area. There's this place called CBGB's, and I remember seeing the Ramones there just before they got signed, and the Talking Heads just before they got signed, and Blondie. There were a bunch of bands that were, and you could sense that something was happening. You couldn't quite, people. It was still the early days of new wave and punk rock and so forth. But you could tell something was brewing, and that club. And there were some others. I remember Max's Kansas City and some others that were on the rise.
Now, this might not seem germane to our conversation, but I guarantee
it did not seem at all germane.
But
I'm not even sure.
I
feel like I walked in the wrong conversation.
I'm going to tie it back in. So we're in Music City, and you talk a little bit about, in the book, The Third Wave, about how a lot of these new entrepreneurial ecosystems are going to depend on some of the businesses that exist, that are more traditional businesses that haven't been impacted necessarily by tech. Where there's still opportunity, and we are in Music City.
Right.
So it would seem that is a good example of a local ecosystem that entrepreneurs can leverage and apply tech to create new jobs and businesses. But before we go too deep into that, can you talk a little bit about what you mean by the third wave?
Sure. Well, it's really the third wave of the internet, and the way I look at it is the first wave was getting America online, getting the world online, taking the idea of the internet and making it real. And I know, most people in this room, particularly younger folks, just grew up with this as part of their lives, and we're kind of digital natives and don't fully appreciate sort of the backstory. But when we started AOL in 1985, only 3% of people were online, and they were on those 3% were online on average 1 hour a week. Right. And most people, when we got started and we're talking about the internet, did not believe it would ever amount to much. They thought it would be limited to sort of hobbyists and hackers and so forth, but never be a mainstream phenomenon. So that first wave was building the on-ramps, the software, the servers, the networks, make it easier to use, more useful, more fun, more affordable, to try to get people, kind of off the sidelines and engaged, not just, consumers to use it, but also getting companies to create services for it, content and other kinds of things. So that really was the first wave. The beginning of that, kind of mid-'80s, essentially nobody knew about or cared about the internet. By the end of it, roughly the year 2000, everybody was connected and they couldn't live without it. Right. That then set the stage for the second wave, which has been most of the last 15 years or so, which is basically building software and services, apps, on top of the internet, and it's, Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's been this app economy. It's been focused particularly on smartphones. The first wave was mostly on PCs. The second wave was mostly on phones, and that's been transformative as well. But now we're moving into this third wave, and it really is the next logical step, really integrating the internet in seamless and pervasive, sometimes even invisible ways, throughout our lives. And the process really disrupts some big sectors: healthcare, education, energy, transportation, food, agriculture. Pretty significant, sectors, pretty important aspects of our lives that have changed a little bit in the first wave and a little bit more in the second wave, but will change a lot in the third wave. But it's going to require, I think, a different mindset for entrepreneurs, a different playbook. Partnerships are going to be much more important. Policy, regulatory issues are going to be much more important. And I really do believe, which is obviously why I'm here today, that a lot of that innovation will happen all across the country, not just on the coast.
Now that gets me into my next question. Thank you. You're doing so great. This is flowing so well. Which is around, you mentioned all of these different industries that are going to be impacted by this third wave. How many opportunities do you see within sort of the Tennessee ecosystem itself? We're here in Tennessee. We're talking to a crowd of Tennessee entrepreneurs. When you think about the industries that are big here, you mentioned healthcare.
Right.
HCA is huge here. What are some of the opportunities that you're seeing, or some of the companies or ideas that you've seen pitched to you from folks coming from this part of the
Well,
country?
I think it's going to be fairly broad. And obviously, Nashville's strong, Chattanooga's strong, Knoxville, Memphis, a lot of parts are strong, and more broadly in the southeast region, you're seeing a lot of momentum in a lot of sort of the neighboring states. I think each city has its own kind of backstory, its own kind of expertise, almost cultural DNA. I think that will be increasingly important in the third wave. There was this truism in the second wave, particularly in Silicon Valley, that essentially ignorance was a competitive advantage.
Right.
That if you, and famously PayPal said that the reason they were successful in taking on the financial service industry is none of the founders knew anything about credit cards, so they could look at it in new ways and ask questions in new ways. It's sort of that naivete was what in some ways their secret sauce, and that is fair, and that was true. And bringing that fresh perspective, asking those new kinds of questions, imagining new kinds of possibilities will continue to be critical. But in the third wave, you're going to have to marry that with domain expertise. That if you want to revolutionize healthcare, it's actually not about the app. That's the starting point. What it really is about working with doctors and hospitals and figuring out how to work with health plans to get reimbursement and work with the government, because healthcare is obviously going to be a regulated sector. So it's how do you obviously focus on the product, the technology, the platform, whatever it might be, but also focus on these other aspects. That plays to the strength of a place like Nashville, because there is a history over decades of understanding that. And I've been there 3 or 4 times in the last 5 years, and there is a lot of innovation happening in that sector. If you look at other parts of the country, the story tends to be a little different. New Orleans, there's a lot of things around education technology. They created a new charter school network post-Katrina. In Pittsburgh, sort of the steel capital kind of powered the Industrial Revolution because of Carnegie Mellon, their expertise in robotics, their history of making stuff. There's a lot of things around robotics. Even Google opened a big office there. Uber doing a lot of their driverless car kind of operations, kind of there. So each of these cities has their own kind of story. At the same time, we're seeing the fact that there can be breakout entrepreneurial successes in cities that have nothing to do with that. And I'll give you 2 examples recently in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. One is a company called Chewy.com, just acquired about a month ago for $3 billion, one of the largest e-commerce exits in history. They're in Fort Lauderdale. There was nothing, and it was basically pets.com done right 20 years later. So it was e-commerce for pet food. Huge success. It would naturally have said, well, the place to do that would be Fort Lauderdale. And in their same building in Fort Lauderdale is a company focused on augmented reality called Magic Leap. It raised $1 billion. Their last valuation was like $7 or $8 billion. Their investors include Google and Alibaba and so forth. Kind of pretty significant kind of engineering involved in that. But it's not in Boston. It's not in Silicon Valley. It's in it's in Fort Lauderdale. So there are always going to be those surprises. But in general, looking at these rise of the rest cities, trying to understand what makes them unique, trying to understand what major companies are there that could be sort of anchor partnerships to accelerate this third wave. That's going to be part of the discussion, while being open to being surprised with great entrepreneurs doing great things that aren't necessarily in sync with the backstory of that particular city.
So a part of that, I think, is about exposure, right? And just getting those entrepreneurs in front of Silicon Valley
Correct.
investors or other investors to get the kind of capital they need to grow the business.
Correct.
When you were talking on stage at Recode last week, Kara got into you a little bit and gave you some ribbing. But in addition to that, Kara Swisher, who was I think she's the editor-in-chief over there now, asked you about what 3 things Valley investors can do or should do to sort of encourage this without taking some of these like patronizing, we're going to go on listening tours around the country and visit the Midwest and see what people are thinking or whatever. I know you have thoughts on that, but what are 3 things that entrepreneurs and investors here can do to reach out to Silicon Valley and make themselves known and their presence known and say, hey, capital from around the world or around the country, we're here and we're open for business and we need your support.
So there are a bunch of things. I would say actually Nashville and more broadly Tennessee is actually doing a really good job of this. And when we launched the Startup America partnership 6 years ago, the first state that we launched was Startup Tennessee, and Michael Burcham took the lead on that and did the Entrepreneur Center here, and there are a lot of great things that have been coming out of that in the last few years. So I think the momentum here is quite strong. But the playbook it tends to be creating more of a network effect, more network density, getting people in the city working to each other. That's why conferences like this are so important. How do you get the entrepreneurs working with the executives of the bigger companies and talking to people who might be angel investors or might be mentors or might be customers or might be partners, and get the mayor and the governor celebrating startups and saying this is the future of our communities. So the first is creating essentially that network density and connecting the dots. And as we travel around these various cities, often things are kind of siloed. Somebody's doing something interesting there, and somebody's doing something interesting there, but they don't necessarily know what each other's are doing, and let alone kind of working together. Number one. Number two is figure out a way to get capital off the sidelines. All these cities we visited, there is wealth there, but often it's not focused on startups. Right. And so how do you make it easier for them to understand? And that's where angel networks come in. That's where we're seeing in a lot of cities the development of micro VC funds, relatively small, $20, $30 million funds that are making kind of early stage investments in their region. And the third is to do a better job of championing your city, celebrating your city, telling the story of your city, and this is again a great week to put Nashville on the map, because a lot of things are happening, a lot of people are coming here. My guess is most people are coming here, unless they are coming for this event, don't know there's a strong startup scene in Nashville, and so telling that story is critically important. And it reminds me, goes back to your earlier question, it reminds me of the early days of the internet 3 decades ago. That most people, when I was talking about the idea of the internet, looked at me with this sort of glassy-eyed look like, you're crazy.
Right.
That's never going to happen. People are not going to get these computers and be typing messages back and forth to each other. That's insane. And when I talk about the rise of the rest, particularly when I'm in Silicon Valley, or people basically say, it's crazy to think you're really going to build a great company in like Nashville or Chicago or St. Louis. They're all, there's sort of arrogance. We've got, they're going to be here, but they will be surprised as over the next decade, the rest rises and some of these cities really kind of move up to the next level. But it does require everybody engaging and saying this is a moment and let's seize it and let's figure out a way to be more supportive of the entrepreneurs locally and create more of a network locally and be more kind of evangelizing, if you will, what's happening to get other people to pay attention, whether it be media or investors or what have you, so it can in fact continue to rise.
Now, how important is an actual? Does the idea of what's investable as a venture backable business need to change? One, for venture investors to get behind something like Shinola, which is like a watch and bike company, but y'all have invested in it. And it's doing quite well, right? From what I understand.
Yeah, no, I think it's important that obviously I love the internet, I love technology, but as we think about entrepreneurship and innovation and job creation and the rise of the rest, we've got to have it in a broader context. And so some of the great successes in the last 10, 20 years are companies like Under Armour in Baltimore. It's had a transformative impact at Baltimore. It's now a global brand that started basically as like a t-shirt company. Right. And then they kept evolving. Or in the restaurant space, we backed a company called Sweet Green. There's others like Chipotle and others, in Denver, huge success. It's created a lot of visibility and a lot of momentum. So it's, whether it be in the food sector or the clothing or athletic wear sector, there are many sectors of the economy where people are creating really interesting companies that have the potential to be kind of breakthrough, really valuable companies, create a lot of jobs in the process. So we have to have a broader definition. I worry that too many people are focused on technology in Silicon Valley, and how do you focus on innovation more broadly and focus on the country more broadly?
Well, so I'd like to continue this discussion by bringing out an entrepreneur who is deeply embedded in all of these discussions. Jay Rogers, who is the CEO and founder of Local Motors, is going to come out right now and have a chat with us as well about some of the ways in which these things are being, these theories about the rise of the rest are being applied on the ground. Thank you so much, Jay. Thanks for joining us. So I'm sure you have opinions about all of this stuff. But first, I'd like to get your take. One of the things that Steve mentioned was this notion that when you were talking about the internet, Steve, people looked at you as sort of glassy-eyed. That's crazy. No one's going to be looking and sending messages on their phones. Jay, I wonder if you feel the same way now, talking to people about 3D printing, and whether you have this same pushback from investors or entrepreneurs where people are saying, that's crazy. No one's ever going to 3D print a car and drive it around.
I mean, I think that absolutely one of the things that probably one of the most impactful meetings I ever had was sitting backstage with Tim Berners-Lee and listening to his sort of Mad Hatter thoughts about what it would mean to have a World Wide Web. And I felt the same thing there as you just described, Steve, which is the same conversation that I have. Henry Ford gave us a world that we know today. Even my mother would tell me how to build a car company. She would say, mass production, stupid. And so those legacies live large. And people, when you change paradigms, people look at you like you're either heretical and they get angry, or they do give you that glassy-eyed look where they want to believe that maybe something is really interesting, but they just don't know how to connect the dots. So yes, I hear it all the time.
And for you, the struggle is real of being a local entrepreneur and trying to raise money from this community when you're talking about doing a sort of deeply transformative business that's got a lot of moving parts to it. What was the most challenging thing for you about getting the business ginned up here in Tennessee?
So one of the first things was that we weren't in Tennessee, and so we were in Phoenix getting started. And the epicenter, I had an idea that it would be possible to make a vehicle digitally. One of the biggest problems that we have in all complex cybermechanical systems that are bigger than a shoebox is they don't ship very well, and therefore innovation doesn't ship very well around them. One of the reasons why Shenzhen works quite well is the things that are put together there can all be prototyped digitally and sent in a FedEx or DHL box quickly. When it gets big, it's difficult to do. So the things we've done with First Build with GE, and the things we've done with Local Motors and vehicles, and the things we're doing with Fuse now and then with Airbus, those things need to happen locally. And so the local epicenter of digital industrial manufacturing, the best I could see, was happening in Oak Ridge. I was looking for someone who was printing large-scale polymers strong enough to be able to make something like a vehicle or an airplane wing or something like that. And so I had to pick up and get myself to that place. And it really didn't mean mailing the check in. I needed to move.
Right.
And so I picked myself up and moved. And I suppose maybe what's different about that is I was trained in the military to do that. The command post in a good military organization doesn't move with everyone with it. They take a jump and they go forward and they see if the fight's developing there. And I think that was the hardest part for me at the beginning, is leaving my company behind in another Rise of the Rest city and going to a place where the innovation was. Knowledge is sticky.
You talk about Oak Ridge, and national laboratories have been key throughout the U.S.'s history in terms of developing new technologies. Fracking started out as a Department of Energy project, right, back in the 70s, that finally took off in the late 90s, early 2000s. So the government has been funding a lot of this stuff for a very long time.
Including the internet.
And including the internet,
Just
right?
so
Well,
by
that's
the way.
the DARPA project right there. And around the same time.
Right.
What is your sense of the role that government is playing now, and what is y'all's sense, both of you, of the role that government should be playing as a continued driver of these kinds of massive multi-billion-dollar businesses that fracking has transformed the U.S. energy economy, and that's a government-funded project.
No, I think the government has and needs to continue to fund the basic research that makes things like the internet or GPS or fracking or other things, kind of possible. Then you have to figure out ways to get that at the right time in the hands of the crazy entrepreneurs who can turn it into like a business and hopefully drive broader adoption. But as we've done these Rise the Rest tours and visited local motors in Phoenix, it has been interesting to see some of the places like in Albuquerque, some really interesting things happening around water technology, Los Alamos and Sandia and others. Really smart people doing really smart things, but all too often it's been kind of funded by the government, and in some of these laboratories is more focused on national security issues or other kind of issues, but taking some of those ideas and also some of those people and helping move them into the the startup sector is a way to take those technologies to scale and also create jobs in these places. So that there are some hidden assets. It's not just going back to what we were talking about before, the expertise that exists in a city like Nashville around healthcare. It's also leveraging the broader talent base, and there is a continuing role for the government to play. Also to figure out ways to then create the right investment incentives to invest capital in some of these emerging ecosystems, these Rise the Rest cities. So I don't think the government can and should be in the business of directly investing, but I think figuring out ways to jumpstart industries, figuring out ways to fund the basic research that makes some of these breakthroughs even possible, and then creating the right incentives around investment and deal with issues around immigration, other things to be a magnet for talent. That's the role of government. The role of entrepreneurs and investors is then to take that and run with it.
Right. Jay, one of your guys was quoted in a Scientific American article talking about the impact that Obama administration era policies around the manufacturing hubs that he had set up in, I think, 2008 or 2012 maybe, played a role in sort of the development of local motors itself and the polymers that you were using, some of the technology coming out of, I think, Oak Ridge. You're over-under on those kinds of things continuing under the current administration without any sort of support from local communities saying, hey, look, we need this. Do you have a take on how important that is? I'm not going to get too political, y'all. I'm going to dial back from this in a second, but I think it's important to...
Look, I will be professionally political in the answer to that question. First of all, entrepreneurs are the protagonist in this story, for sure. I mean, when I first read Toffler's Third Wave and then Steve, yours, it was the first impression that entrepreneurs are the rock stars. You all that are here as entrepreneurs are the rock stars. Government is not the rock star. And so when you think about the creation of something like the National Network for Manufacturing Innovation Institutes, which is even hard to get out, and now we've changed the name, I have an opinion that is based on my own version of trying to be a rock star in this industry. Right. I saw a technology that I saw a need. I went to go find a technology. It happened to be located in Knoxville. Right. And it needed to be tied to online CAD that hadn't even been created yet, cloud-based CAD and cloud-based simulation. So there was a lot that wasn't even resident with it. The NNMIs were what I would consider to be a very vertical look at capabilities to say, I'm going to be good at wide band gap electronics. I'm going to be good at polymers. I'm going to be good at 3D printing. That's what an NNMI was. And if you ask me as an entrepreneur, at first it was attractive. But yet, at Oak Ridge, the manufacturing demonstration facility, which was not an NNMI and had been funded in a very different way, was actually doing more at the time than the NNMI was. Why? From the cheap seats, because NNMIs had to gather money to match federal funds.
Right.
And so they were reaching all over the country, or in very wide geographic swaths, to raise the $70 million matching to try to beat out their competitors, which meant instead of being local, I have a university from San Francisco partnering with somebody from Ohio State, partnering with somebody from Florida, and to get anything done, it was very difficult. Whereas all the time at MDF, they just said, you want to 3D print a car? We're going to make it happen.
Right.
And we did.
But was that MBF who was running that MBF program? Was that a public-private partnership?
I mean, look, who was running it at the time? MDF was a version of a public-private partnership, and an enterprising lab director, Tom Mason at the time, an incredible team that was trying to get it happen. I mean, I think it does come down to people, a great set of legislatures, and a really good Department of Energy. And so, I mean, your specific question about NNMIs, like I said, to keep it professionally political, is I think NNMIs were a necessary look at technology areas that to the Obama administration, and look, I have an enormous respect for John Holdren and for the Commerce Department at the time that put that in place. I'm not sure that it's worked as well as we've needed. That doesn't mean it should be defunded, but it means that we should focus on what works and what doesn't work.
Right.
And I think that things like MDF, for my money as an entrepreneur, worked like crazy and still do.
Well, I think like the idea that there's a 0-1 argument is not one that I was trying to posit or make, but simply that like there is a middle ground between 0 and 1 that needs to be explored, and it seems like the previous administration had a 1 perspective, and the current administration has kind of a 0 perspective, and I don't know that either is necessarily the way forward. But there's got to be some
but I also would
conversation.
say I think the jury's out. It's a new administration, relatively young, and they're still assembling their team, still putting the priorities in place. I hope, for example, even though it hasn't been a focus yet, that the rise of the rest and promoting regional entrepreneurship will be a focus. It should be a focus. If you look at the states that Trump won, in total it was 30 states. In aggregate, those 30 states last year got just 15% of venture capital. So there is a reason why job creation is lagging there, because investment in startups that create the jobs is lagging there. So it should be a focus. So it's early days. Obviously, there's some things that happen that may make some of us a little nervous. But in fairness to them, they've got a number of years, and hopefully some of the priorities that will ultimately be helpful to entrepreneurs in the audience, helpful to Nashville and Knoxville and Chattanooga and Memphis and other parts of this region. My guess is as they shift their focus from things that they're healthcare and other things right now to focusing on how do we make sure we remain the most innovative entrepreneur nation, how do we sure we have a more evenly dispersed and geographically dispersed innovation economy, how are we creating enough jobs in those places to offset the jobs that will be lost due to technology, whether it be AI or robotics. And this is not something new that 200 years ago, over 90% of us worked on farms. Now it's less than 2% because of technology. It would be easier to basically do that. And as a result, instead of 88% of people being unemployed, we then went on to create the Industrial Revolution and the technology revolution. We have to keep creating these new revolutions, keep creating these new jobs, and I hope that will become more of a focus in the months ahead.
Well,
John, can I add on to that
ahead.
really fast, which is like the names that live large in the creation of what we do right now are Haslam, Commissioner Boyd, Rohero, Burchett. I mean, these are mayors and governors here that can make autonomous driving happen. They don't need a federal government to make autonomous driving happen. And so I think that that's a really good point of, regardless of what you think about the current administration, a move like was recently introduced to get infrastructure down to cities, and that seems to be my experience with where the moves have happened and need to happen. There's a place for federal agencies to definitely be engaged, and a 0 would be a big mistake. But I have found that more motion has happened through local government.
Well, I mean, I think you're seeing a return to federalism, right? And in like a real way where it's the states that are active on all of these issues and the federal government, well, I'm saying the states are more active on all of these issues, getting into that debate around federalism, than the federal government itself, right? Where you've got the devolution of responsibility to places like, California is now driving sort of environmental regulations, right?
But it's always going to be a mix. So the local level would be a city or a state. There obviously it's a platform for innovation, almost like a kind of a petri dish, and kind of like how do you figure out, try different things and so forth. But as things scale, they tend to be more national. There's always going to be national issues around, kind of the regulation of drugs, for example, or different things like that. There are always going to be national issues around tax policy. What are the right investment incentives to, encourage more of these job-creating, kind of startups? There are always going to be at a national level issues around immigration and borders and so forth. So there's clearly a set of things that can and should happen at a local level, and there's also a set of things that need to happen at sort of a national level. The challenge is, how do you make sure the opportunities? How do you make sure they're working together in tandem?
Well, Jay, so you talk about the ways in which mayors can be supportive or local government can be supportive here, and I'm wondering, what's on your wish list from the state of Tennessee or from the different, the different cities around the state to get things rolling, not just for you, but for other entrepreneurs? Like, is there any sort of system or package of reforms that you'd like to see from the state, from the city, that could really encourage not just what y'all are doing around autonomous driving, which is very cool. I wish we had more time to just dig into that, because that's a whole other 40-minute conversation. But yeah, like what are you hoping to see from state local government?
So the first thing I would say may not be what you were expecting, but it is to take heart. And so what I would say is, I had a conversation with the minister in charge of the Bahamas, and so the prime minister, if you will. And one of the things, I said, what are your two greatest problems? And he said, brain drain and fuel costs. And I can't do anything about them. I think that's not true. And I think when I'm speaking to local leaders, like mayors and that type of person, is there are incredible opportunities locally. I'm just one. Steve's talked about a bunch. And the enterprising mayors and governors that actually believe in the local institutions that they have, they're not waiting for a Google to feed it, and they're not waiting for a federal government to feed it. They get in the trenches and they make it happen. Right. So what I would say is taking heart is the first place. Right. That's what I would like to see, actually not sitting back in the Combined Civic Government Center, but actually going out and getting involved in business. That's what I would like to see. When the mayor comes to my business or the governor comes to my business, it makes a big difference. Right.
Does that include, I was going to say, does that include, Steve, from your perspective, should cities be setting up seed funds? Like, should they be getting involved at the local level in seeding local entrepreneurs?
Some cities, some states have done different programs that generally are ways to incent the creation of more funds. Again, not directly investing, but creating some incentives, sometimes some matching concepts, sometimes sort of a layer of debt. The SBA does this with their SBIC program. That essentially, for every dollar the venture fund raises, they actually have the ability to raise, invest $3, which helps. So there are some things like that can help do things. But the most important thing is, and we're starting to see this, is having mayors and governors recognize that the future of their city, their state, is largely in the hands of the entrepreneurs. That they are the ones that are going to create the jobs of the future, and the ones that get this right and trying to create the right environment, like you're in Nashville, I think will do well. The ones that get this wrong will lose their way. And the Detroit story, it's the first stop of our first Rise the Rest 2 or 3 years ago was in Detroit, and it was deliberate because Detroit was Silicon Valley 75 years ago. It was this vibrant, growing place, and then because of some decisions, both government decisions and corporate decisions, kind of lost its way, lost 60% of its population, and went bankrupt. And so it's a reminder that these things kind of rise and fall. What's encouraging to me at the recent South by Southwest conference, there's 23 mayors talking about this, and the dialogue has shifted from economic development as getting some company to move their headquarters or open a factory, to how do you create the right environment so entrepreneurs, including folks in this room, can create the big companies of tomorrow. Every Fortune 500 company starts as a startup. So if you're not focusing on those startups, you're not going to create the big companies of tomorrow.
I mean, I totally agree with you, but I think there's also in that a cautionary tale as well. If you look at what happened with Uber and Pittsburgh as like an example of how things can go completely and totally freaking awry. I mean, like that relationship has destroyed that city, or that That
Well, I
initial
know.
partnership has done a pretty good number on that city.
So, but I can speak to that one specifically. The mayor of Pittsburgh is a friend of mine, and I think that those dysfunctions you'll find anywhere in any business. Also, you have a particular type of business that Uber, Lyft, Didi, Get, Ola are, which is ones that are grown to create markets through basically an underutilized asset, which is the car that we have out there. And so it's a lot of money. I mean, enormous amount of money that has been thrown around, and there is an existential fight to hold on to that value creation. And so Uber and Lyft, but Uber specifically, is in a fight to the death to attract any kind of autonomy that they can, because they are in an existential battle. And so their ride into Pittsburgh was rough. And I think that those are I don't think you're going to see that play again and again and again. That's not something that repeats.
Well, they're going to get ridden out of Pittsburgh.
That
probably.
may be
I
the
mean,
case, and I think
We'll see, but it goes back to the third wave topic, which is the main point there is, I don't think debating who did what or should have done what, although there's some lessons I'm sure can be learned from that, but recognizing that in the third wave, the government's going to have a seat at the table. You don't like to hear that because the government slows you down and stifles innovation, is bureaucratic and does stupid things, and obviously there's a lot of truth to that. But when we shift from apps, like a way to book a restaurant or take a photo and share it, to the most fundamental aspects of our lives, like how do we keep our families healthy? How do we manage kind of smarter cities that are more kind of energy efficient? How do we think about education in the future that's more personalized and adaptive? How do we create more innovative things in food systems that move us more towards kind of health? There's a bunch of pretty fundamental things, let alone on the transportation side. There are going to be some regulations around driverless cars on the roads. There are going to be some regulations around drones in the sky. And it's not because you're pro-regulations, because you, thinking about your own families, will say, you know what, my 16-year-old driver, I want to make sure like the infrastructure working, or I don't want like that drone to crash into my kid's playground. So there should be some rules of the road, and just understanding that the third wave is about everyday life in much more fundamental ways. How do we wrestle with some of these policy issues so it fuels innovation, but also does it in a responsible way? This will be one of the great battles of the next 10 or 20 years, and we have to figure out, whether it be at a city or state level or at a national level, how do we get this right so this country leads the way in the third wave, as opposed to having led the first wave and the second wave, kind of get left behind in the third wave.
I could talk and ask these guys questions for a while. I did want to open it up to a few questions. We probably have time for maybe one or two. If there's folks in the audience that have one, I'm sure someone will be coming around with a microphone. If not, I can just keep talking to these fellas. I could talk to these fellas all day. Anybody got anything, or you want me to keep going? I will keep going. Then.
You got one up there.
I don't see.
Somebody got one.
Somebody
up
in the back. All right, go ahead.
I don't see him.
Was there one? Now we're just dead air.
Oh,
there's one right there in the front. We'll do it. Hey, how are you, sir? All right. Is there anyone with a mic who wants to come down and give this? Or if you
Stand
shout it
up
up
and
to
yell.
me, stand up and yell. Before you answer, I'm just going to repeat it. So he asked about blockchain technology and its role in the
But
third
he first
wave.
said some very nice things about
Well,
the
he
third
did.
wave.
He said it was amazing. He said it was the most brilliant book he'd ever read.
No, I think blockchain is a tremendous foundational technology, and there's a lot of innovation now happening. Literally thousands of companies doing different things with it. I think the initial focus was more on the cryptocurrency side, Bitcoin, things like that. I think now that while that's still important, there's a lot of things happening there. There's now a broader recognition that it really is a much more fundamental technology for contracts and other kinds of things. So it's very exciting to see what happens there. Again, it will require this third wave dialogue and partnership between the innovators and the policymakers. It's going to require a lot of partnerships with some of the institutions to figure out ways to deploy that technology and get people to embrace the platforms, the software platforms, and things like that. But it clearly clearly is, along with some of the other ones we talked about, AI and robotics and so forth, among the most interesting technologies to watch as the third wave develops.
Anyone else out there? Well, because the blockchain thing actually brings up an interesting point that I'm going to take this. I'm sorry, y'all. I'm just doing it. Which is alternative sources of capital for entrepreneurs. And I think that there's been a notion, maybe falsely influenced by the press, that venture capital is sort of one of the only ways to go if you're going to start to fund your business. And that's just, Jay, I think you know that's just not true. And now there's crowdfunding opportunities. There are coin sales through cryptocurrency opportunities if you want to build off of the blockchain to really finance your business in alternative ways. How do you look at that as an investor, Steve? And Jay, when you think about fundraising for your next adventures, would you turn to the crowd to do it? Steve, if you want to.
Well, severally. First of all, it's worth pointing out that most businesses in America are bootstrapped. Right. They do not ever raise venture capital. So the idea that it's essential is clearly factually inaccurate. It is helpful as an accelerator, particularly in sectors where there's a lot of innovation happening and moving quickly is important, and that capital can help attract the team and so forth and accelerate the marketing or whatever you're doing. So it can be catalytic, but there are many examples where companies have flourished without raising venture capital, number one. Number two, I do think these next generation platforms are going to be incredibly important. Crowdfunding was part of the Jobs Act as an example of that. You've seen billions of dollars, thousands of companies created because of Kickstarter and Indiegogo, many of which, probably most of which, would not have seen the light of day without having that platform, and now having the ability to use the internet to actually raise capital for companies, which was banned until the Jobs Act passed. The rule that it was replacing was put in place in 1933, the Securities Act of 1933, which not only pre-internet, it was pre-television. The rules had not changed, and now you can use the internet. There's still work to be done with the SEC on refining those rules, streamlining those rules, because right now they're frankly a little onerous, so it's a little hard to use. But figuring out other ways to kind of provide access to capital will be particularly important to places like Nashville, and also to people. The other data point that is troubling and sobering, we talked about last year 75% of venture capital going to just 3 states. Last year, 90% of venture capital went to men, only 10% to women. People of color, African Americans, less than 1%. So how do you level this playing field so everybody, everywhere, has a shot at the American dream, has a shot of starting companies, has a shot of scaling companies, and we have an ability to create jobs across the country, across the landscape, not just in a few places. That's one of the areas where these new platforms are important. But the most important, so it's one to emphasize this audience, is not what some investor in Silicon Valley might do or what some new platform like crowdfunding might do, but what the community can do and must do to rally to support these entrepreneurs. So the angel networks that form to support these entrepreneurs and provide some of that initial capital to get them going is critically important. So it's not something to, rather than complain about what's not happening, doubling down on what is happening and trying to take that to the next level will have a catalytic impact in the cities in Tennessee and more broadly in this region.
Jay, would you seek alternative sources of capital at this point?
You and I have talked about this before, and if there's any message that I could give to local entrepreneurs is don't look for venture capital in the works that you're doing. Go and find the money from your customers. I know it sounds trite, but if you think it's not you, look again.
Right.
Go and find the money from your customers. And then beyond that, one thing that I will say, which is in support of a lot of the things that Steve has written is, and all of the other supporting institutions that get the customers to trust you at that stage. One of the beauties of the team that founded Indiegogo, who has now funded over $1 billion, that company alone, in companies through customer capital, is they started out with sort of when you wish funding projects like support my healthcare campaign or support this disease management program that I have for a family member, all wonderful, but then it was CDs, and then it was t-shirts, and then it was things that were more hardware and less wonderful, and then all of a sudden the magic of the products that came out of it, and then we did something horrid to them. We came along with First Build, and we said, how about a corporation funding on Indiegogo? And Kickstarter turned it down. Right. They said, no way. And Indiegogo said, hell yeah.
Yeah.
And that is incredible because what it said is a corporation like GE didn't turn to the street or commercial paper. Jeff Immelt, who will not be renowned for raising the stock price of GE, but will be renowned, I hope, for fundamentally setting up that company to be the only remaining member of the original Dow to make another 100 years, set out and said, yeah, I'll take capital from customers. And then insurance falls in behind it and all of the other things you need as an entrepreneur to get your product into the hands of a crowdfunder. It's incredible. It is based in the blockchain. And it is something that if you don't realize the biggest revolution that's going to happen, it's in the go-to-market strategy. We could talk about engineering all we want, but getting your customer to tell you what they want. And people forget the other half of Local Motors is crowdsourcing. We co-create the ideas because we have to hear from you as a customer what you want. And that is really the difference between what the blockchain created and what otherwise would have been.
That was beautifully stated. And unfortunately, we're going to have to end it right there. I'd like to thank the rock stars that shared the stage with me for sure, and the rock star entrepreneurs.
Thank you all.
In the
Good
audience.
luck.
Thank you so much.
Sir, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Safe travels back. Thank you. Thanks, buddy. Thanks, Jennifer. Appreciate it.